Hello, everyone. My name is Vanessa De La Torre, Executive Editor of the New England News Collaborative, a regional collaboration of 9 public media stations. And I'm excited to welcome you all to today's webinar, hosted by the New England Equity Reporting Community of Practice. This is an effort that began in 2021 with dozens of journalists who wanted to improve news reporting and coverage on issues of race and identity in New England, with an eye also on creating a more inclusive newsroom culture through trainings and sharing information on best practices. So it's with that mission in mind that we've brought in a fabulous journalist, Phillip Martin, for today's webinar on reporting in a polarized society. It's an honor for me to introduce Phillip. He's a senior investigative reporter at GBH News in Boston, who has tackled some of the most sensitive and challenging stories in New England in recent years. His reporting includes the GBH News investigation, Unseen: The Boy Victims of the Sex Trade, which won a National Murrow Award last year for excellence in diversity, equity, and inclusion. He's also been covering the rise of white supremacist neo-Nazi activity in our region. And Phillip is also a former Neiman Fellow among his many accomplishments. So we're so grateful that Phillip is joining us to share his expertise on reporting in a polarized society, sharing how journalists can unpack and name the divisive forces hiding just below the surface, as well as ones in plain sight. And, as journalists, how can we detect signs of polarization in communities we cover and in our own newsrooms? Now, just to give you a sense of the next hour, Phillip will give his presentation for about 40 minutes or so, with the rest of the time dedicated to Q&A. And we welcome your questions in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. And with that, I'm going to toss it to Phillip. Welcome.
Vanessa, thank you. And it's good to see you again.
You too.
I am really honored to make this presentation and to meet all of you and to take your questions and to talk about my own experience, and hoping that it will help in terms of what you're doing at the moment. I'm going to initially talk about where I'm from, because I think you have to talk where you're from plays a major factor in how you report. And it doesn't matter where you're from. It's a question of using your experience, that which you've learned, that which you've inculcated, that which has shaped you. It's important to bring that into your reporting. Now, that might sound counterintuitive to what a lot of people learn in journalism school. The notion that it may sway you one way or another. Well, of course it does, because I think what your background does is it basically informs it informs your reporting in ways the same way that the notion of memory in history, when you combine those things, memory and history informs your reporting. I don't think you can actually be a really good reporter without actually studying history, and without relying heavily on memory and thus empathy. I'm from Detroit, and I'm going to go through a few photos that illustrate where I'm from. This house here, for example, is a couple blocks from where I grew up. This photo was actually taken just a few weeks ago. And the idea of a society changing is part of what is illustrated by this house. You see the fields next door. When I was growing up, there were lots of houses side by side, this one. But now what you find in Detroit, you find a lot of blight, but you also find a lot of beautiful stories. Not far from this house, like the one in the back, for example, you find where people are struggling to keep up, to make, even in the worst conditions, to make their houses homes. And the point of that is that is a story about complexity. We can go to the next slide. Growing up, I wanted to be a journalist. That's a young picture of me, much younger than I am now, of course. And the reason I wanted to be a journalist is because I saw the way that newspapers, read the way that they were covering my neighborhood. I would listen at night to radio news stations, in the way they covered my communities. I would watch on television the sort of one-dimensional portrayal of where I grew up. And from a very young age, and this is much older than I was when I came up with these thoughts, I wanted to cover my neighborhood in a way that was more complex, where I saw people taking care of their lawns in the even in the midst of blight, where I saw folks helping each other, not robbing and killing each other, as was often portrayed in news stories at night. Yes, there was some of that too, without question. But what I mainly saw was a neighborhood where people assisted other people. We can go to the next slide. In high school, most popular in class, clown, and that helped me, believe it or not. That helped me in terms of where I wanted to go. Being popular meant turning these ideas and thoughts that I was always talking about in school into reality. Being popular was actually about leading walkouts at my school in the 1970s over the firing of teachers, over racist curriculum, over the portrayal again of my neighborhood by newspapers. We actually had a sit-in outside a newspaper. That same newspaper, by the way, I worked for years later on the docks of the Detroit Free Press, where I would basically go through the newspaper at night to see how they were covering events. That also influenced my journalism. We can go to the next slide. This is, again, Detroit. This is the back of a home, not far from where I grew up. Again, showing you the complexity of a neighborhood that even in the context of blight, and even in the context of deteriorating and broken down houses, abandoned houses, fields that are now strewn with the weeds. You find alongside those fields strewn with weeds, houses that have been painted to give people a sense of neighborhood. We can go to the next slide. This was the recreation center where I used to go for writing instruction. It's no longer functioning. It's abandoned, in fact. It's ironically and coincidentally perhaps called Martin's Recreation Center. This was going past there the other day, or a few weeks ago rather. It just brought back the memories of what was important to me, and also the people who assisted me at that time, without knowing it, in a trajectory toward journalism. We can go to the next slide. This is also Detroit. This you often find within urban centers and other places these stark contradictions of homes that have been bulldozed, and you have fields there instead. And then downtown, you find vibrancy. This is called the Renaissance Center for reasons that are obvious. In the 1970s and 80s, it was thought that if you built something and then started expanding, you could, in fact, recreate the city. I would go through, it would take me forever to go through my thesis on that, but I would just say that this is part of the contrast of the city. And it's also part of that complexity that informs me as a journalist. We can go to the next slide. Again, part of the complexity that informs me informs my journalism. Here you have one of Detroit's icons, Dinah Ross, with Detroit in the background, and efforts to basically instill pride in a neighborhood by showing where people come from. And yes, Dinah Ross and Motown are a great part of Detroit, and that's why this is exemplified here. Final slide, I think. Yes, again, Detroit, hustle born here. That's one of the slogans now for the city that informs me. Now, the reason I've talked about all of this, I've begun by talking about Detroit, is because I found years later that when I report in our increasingly polarized society, I find that even if I'm approaching an individual who I might not have any, there would be nothing in common that we would find if we were, if I was not a reporter and we were just talking on the streets, me and some of the folks I've interviewed. For example, a Trump supporter who I interviewed in Youngstown, Ohio, named Bill Amashi. What I found in having a conversation with Bill over a period of days when I was covering covering Trump supporters in his community, what I found was that we come from similar backgrounds. We come from working class backgrounds. Some of what he talked about in terms of union organizing and losing jobs and so on and so forth, I saw that and experienced that consistently in Detroit. My own father worked for a while in auto. Bill Amashi worked in auto. Bill Amashi talked about the economic problems that he felt drove him to support Donald Trump in 2016 and in 2020. And again, what was most important in my conversations with this individual was understanding and being empathetic to that which he was talking about, or what he was talking about. He had just lost his home in 2016, had gone into a housing gone into basically living in a substandard housing that he was not used to, and was raising a daughter and a son. And what was most important for me was not to judge his support for Donald Trump, but to understand why he felt he wanted to support Donald Trump then and now. I'm going to play this clip.
And look at what these big tax cuts, most of them are going to their shareholders instead of going to the people that make the product. I think that's wrong. That's not the president's doing, it's the corporations doing. But I think the corporate mentality of keeping all the money at the top is a big problem in this country.
Are you seeing any difference in your own paycheck?
About $20 right at.
What do you do with those $20?
What can you do with $20? It's gas. You know, it might help pay a bill. You know, my kids are in softball and, you know, different activities. $20 really doesn't stretch that far.
And just a word about Bill Amashi. The reason that he's talking about his economic anxieties. Now, I pointed out time and time again the contradictions of Donald Trump in terms of there were many people in Ohio who felt that, well, he has brought jobs to the area. Then I pointed out the reality that he really hadn't, that he had created businesses and people said he could relate to construction workers. Well, he had created businesses. He had also got bankrupt 7 times and had refused to pay construction workers and so on and so forth. But more important than my pointing those things out is always important, because I don't believe in both sidisms. I believe that you have to point out the realities and the facts and the truth, even as you are talking with these individuals and even as you're writing your story. But what was most important for me was to get a complex picture of who Bill Amashi was and is, and not simply see him as a Trump supporter. So in my time with him, I found out that this father of 2, who had living in Youngstown, which had become sort of this metaphor, like Detroit, for jobs lost, factories closed, and the disappearances of the 9 to 5 middle class. Bill Amashi sort of represented that, every person, if you will. And few things made him prouder than his school-aged daughter, who still aspires to be a doctor, his son who just joined the military, his own stint in the US Navy, and his job as a crane operator at a factory just across the state line in Pennsylvania. Bill is this big, stout guy who laughs easily. he worried about staying employed and above water. He had seen hard times. Again, with his kids, he lives in a trailer park that he refuses to call home. Home for him was this 3-bedroom house that wasn't too far from where he lived at this point. But he lost that house during the recession, and he was worried. And he said he blamed the politician who was in office at that moment. And that's how often it works. And he blamed high tariffs. And so he was looking for something new. And the person he saw in terms of creating something new was Donald Trump. So that was important for me to get his story out, regardless, again, of the contradictions. You report on the contradictions, but you also report on the person and who he was and is, and why he made the decision that he made. I'm going to also talk about other reporting that I think is informed by, again, this notion of empathy, and by understanding the combination of history and memory. My own memory, a memory of a nation, as well as history. And the reason I look at those things together is that by looking at those things together along with data, you are able to commit to more truthful reporting, to more factual reporting. Memory, of course, can be tricky. A lot of people remember what they want to remember. Most of us, in fact, do. At some point in our lives, we blot out that which is problematic. Sometimes embellish that which is makes us look fantastic, and then that becomes our truth. But it's contradicted oftentimes by history. You could say that for sure about the moment that we're in right now. A lot of people will talk about they want to return to when America was great, the 1950s, for example. Well, I think their memory might establish America, those older people, as great. History records that as a moment of incredible oppression, suppression, repression, for example, against Black people, against immigrants who weren't allowed to come here, not until 1964, 65, when civil rights laws changed. And what we are seeing right now, for example, is a new moment in immigration, where immigrants have become the boogeyman, and where there is oftentimes a failure to cover this issue in a complex way. This has also led to polarization in our society. We're seeing more and more polarization around the issue of immigration, even in places where people never see someone who is from another country in their community. Bill Amashi's son, for example, told me he despised many immigrants in his community. And then I find out that there were no immigrants, recent immigrants, in his community. There was no one who had just crossed the border in his community, in his immediate community at that point. But they have become as I said, the boogeyman for a sort of a new and expanding, it's not new, we revisit this often, but an expanding polarization. You're finding more and more migrants who are coming in, of course, from across the border being brought into New York, being brought to here in Massachusetts, and a lot of concern. I saw a poll yesterday, in an article yesterday in Commonwealth magazine, where it said that more and more people in the Commonwealth are becoming incensed over the notion of immigration. And you're going to find this plays large and huge in the upcoming election. Not long ago, I interviewed someone. I'm going to try to share my screen here. I did a story called The Gangs of Nantucket. And yes, you can chuckle at that title. Nantucket, of course, has homes that start at about 2.8 million today. I think the average home is around $4 million. It is a playground for the rich, without question. But it also depends on workers. And many of those workers are immigrant workers who have come here to make a better life for themselves. And some of them came to Nantucket, where they need painters and where they need construction workers and where they need gardeners. And one of these individuals, I think it's in the chat here. Hold on just a second. Thank you very much. I'm glad you, thank you, Tara, for putting the link here. Henry Lemus Calderon had crossed the border. He had been picked up by his uncle, came to Nantucket, was in school there, and at one point he did what a lot of young people do. He got into this notion of bravado and was sort of puffing his chest out, sort of metaphorically, around school and saying he was a member of not MS-13, but the rival gang, Barrio 18. And these are Salvadoran gangs that began in the United States, by the way, in Los Angeles. And the authorities basically said, well, if you think you're a gang member, then you are a gang member. And this led to a series of reports about the notion of what is reality. If someone states they're a gang member, and the police say, well, if you're a gang member, you are a gang member, and that leads them not just to the Nantucket police, to the attention of the Nantucket police, but to ICE in this instance, and then to being incarcerated, and then to being on the verge of being deported. We have to look at the power then of how information is interpreted. For ideological reasons, it was interpreted by those who arrested Henry Lemus Calderon as being true and factual, and that he represented the problematic issue that Donald Trump at the time, the president at the time, was talking about, the problem of gangs coming into our country, essentially on the back of immigration. I'm going to play just a little bit of this to give you a better idea what it is I'm talking about when I talk about the conflict, again, between misinformation, reality, and the ideology that can basically make misinformation take on a life of its own. I'm going to share my screen. And share the sound. Here goes. Again, this is part 2, the gangs of Nantucket. It's 7 minutes long. We don't have that much time, so I'm just going to play a part of this.
Choir boy or gangster? Just who is Henry Lemus Calderon of Nantucket? During an anti-gang sweep of the island last year by immigration and customs agents, he was among those arrested. He is now awaiting possible deportation to El Salvador. Calderon supporters say ICE is trumping up charges and using the threat of gangs to sweep up undocumented young men from Central America. ICE already knew he was in the country and knew exactly where he lived. WGBH Radio senior investigative reporter Phillip Martin explores his case in part 2 of our series on the gangs of Nantucket.
Henry Lemus Calderon, by his own admission, was not a choir boy, even though he sang in one. He attended services here at Faro de Luz Church on Nantucket, where the Reverend Rigoberto Lemus presides. Lemus, a common Salvadoran name on Nantucket and no relation to Henry, says Calderon spent a lot of time behind these doors.
We'd have a service Wednesday, Saturday, and Sunday, and he always come those days. And he always volunteered to open the door, receive the brothers and sisters, and is a good person.
Calderon says he fled El Salvador after 18th Street gang members demanded monthly payments in exchange for his life. Calderon crossed the U.S.-Mexico border on foot in early 2014 along with thousands of other unaccompanied minors to escape gang violence. The Obama administration allowed some to stay if they had a sponsor. Calderon's uncle, Rodolfo Lemus, lives on Nantucket, and within a short while, the teen was enrolled at Nantucket High. By all accounts, he was a good student and excelled in algebra, says his cousin, Jocelyn Ramirez.
He won excellence awards like in his first few months of being here, and he barely spoke English, and he was already getting awards and doing so well in school.
But a year after arriving on Nantucket, a police report written by a school resource officer sketched a very different portrait of Calderon. Handwritten notations on a report tagged him as a member of the notorious 18th Street Gang. He was accused of threatening to beat up another student, a self-identified member of MS-13. Calderon was also alleged to have marked the school bathroom with the words,
La Mara nunca muere,
which translates to, the gang never dies. But Zola Gomez, Henry's attorney, says this and other conclusions reached by the school were based on a limited understanding of what determines a gang.
There are certain things that you have to do. There are certain things that they expect you to go through in order to become a member, in order to be recognized and respected as a so-called member of a gang.
Gomez points out that Henry Calderon was never arrested for any crime on Nantucket, and she says her client neither dressed like a gang member nor has gang tattoos. But Chris Cronin, who heads up ISIS enforcement and removal program in New England, says traditional gang markers have changed.
In the past, there would be tattoos that were, overt, and everybody could see them if somebody was wearing a T-shirt.
Cronin says Central American gangs, including those on Nantucket, have resorted to more subtle ways of demonstrating membership.
So it is challenging identifying folks that are part of gangs in today's world.
But what happens when some identify themselves as gang members, as several young men at Nantucket High School apparently did? Lieutenant Angus McVicker of the Nantucket Police says it's simple.
If they're going to go ahead and identify themselves, then we're going to treat them as that.
That is problematic, says attorney Lisa Thoreau, who heads Strategies for Youth, which focuses on improving police-youth relations. She says by that example, what might ordinarily be written off as teenage bravado is being taken to a whole different level by local law enforcement with life-altering consequences. Calderon now sits in an ICE detention center facing deportation.
On Nantucket, you have a perfect storm of school resource officers having to address normative behaviors of youth, intersecting with Homeland Security investigations, which has the agenda of trying to rid this country of people they see undesirable. And it appears that the lines aren't clear about what level of proof is necessary.
Nantucket police vehemently deny any suggestion that its officers engage in ethnic profiling. But one resident, Fernando Ramos, believes that undocumented Salvadoran youth are painted with broader brushstrokes than other students at the high school. Ramos, a U.S. citizen, and Calderon ate lunch together in the cafeteria. Ramos is convinced that the gang label attached to Calderon is based in part on observing Central Americans hanging out together.
So many white people are with their white groups and Hispanics with the Hispanics. So in his case, he didn't speak any English. And he straight out came from El Salvador. So obviously kids are gonna see him as a different, so he sees the first person that he knows. Obviously they speak Spanish.
Okay. So anyway, you get the picture, the gangs of Nantucket. Let me just talk about this just for a little bit. This became a really much of a flashpoint in terms of coverage, because there were some people in ICE who said, well, that was absolutely unfair, the way your spin, if you will, on this story. And the fact of the matter is, I let the story go where it was going. It was whatever was uncovered is what we uncovered. If we had found that Calderon was actually a member of the gang, we would have said that. It later turned out, and a judge agreed, that he had been wrongly accused of being a gang member and was moments away from being deported. He, by the way, now has a green card. He's back on Nantucket. He finished school. GED, I should say. He never graduated never walked across the stage. And it was determined, in fact, that much of what he had been saying what's amounted to bravado, but not truth. And the story was complex because you have communities that are reluctant to talk to reporters, immigrant communities among them. And so you really have to establish relationships with folks. And that's, again, where empathy comes in. And I don't mean empathetic to the point of obscuring facts and truth, but empathy to the point where you're listening, actually listening, and asking questions that might allow you to go deeper. And a lot of those questions, again, are questions that have been generated as a result of my background, of understanding of what, for example, what working people, why they might be reluctant to talk to me on Nantucket, where they depended heavily on the perception of those who employ them as to whether they're going to continue in that employment, so on and so forth. So it became absolutely critical, again, to make my way to the island, to get to know folks on the island in the working class community there, but also to interview, as I did in part one of this series, and you can hear that on your own if you like, to interview folks who were astonished that there was any notion of gangs on Nantucket. That brings me to the final point. There were, I don't know if there still are, gangs on Nantucket. People who did, in small numbers, who preyed on their country people. I'm reluctant, by the way, to use the term countrymen, but so if that's an awkward term and is clumsy, forgive me, but who preyed on their country people, and from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Jamaica, and that small number of people were among those who were picked up at the same time as Henry Lemus Calderon. I'm going to just make a couple more examples. I'm not going to play tape because it will take much too long, and I'm eager to get to your questions with Vanessa. The same lessons about empathy, the same lessons about understanding memory and history apply when you're talking about another issue that I raised in 2018, which had not been covered by and large by US media, and that is the issue of caste. I initiated a series called Caste in America. This is before Isabel Wilkerson's book. And the reason for this series, it came about as a result, like a lot of stories. I was having a conversation with a young man from South Asia, from India. And he said that he had encountered a situation because someone found out his last name. And I said, that's interesting. Tell me more. And so we sat down on a park bench here in Boston. And he said that he had lost his job because of the job that had been offered, because they found out that he was a Dalit. That term used to be known as untouchable. And it occurred to me that casteism, something which we've known about for years, of course, might have followed folks from India to their jobs or their new lives here in the United States, as it has in Britain, for example. And that led us to this series, Caste in America. A difficult series because in talking with Indians across a wide swath, mainly Indians and people from Nepal, across a wide swath of society here in the Boston area and across the country, this was a national series, we found people extremely reluctant to talk about casteism. And when they did, it was always off the record, and it was always, or I would say usually off the record, and always in the context of that was something that happened in India, but it doesn't happen here. We found out something to the contrary. That became an important collaboration between GBH and the Pulitzer Center, because the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, with their help, we were able to go to India to actually look at caste and to travel to India with a fellow named Suraj Yende, who is a Harvard fellow who said his Harvard pedigree was irrelevant in India, because caste in India and in some parts of the United States, he said, because caste followed him wherever he went. And he explained that when we went to his village in Nanded in Maharashtra, in the province of Maharashtra, the state of Maharashtra. And there we were able to look at his life and the factors that contribute to casteism, including the belief that people who work in sewage are and must be, according to some religious edicts, must be below caste, Dalits, untouchables. So that is one of the stories that I came up with in a series that we presented that took on a life of its own, because currently there's a more and more focus on casteism in the United States, not just, of course, in the context of South Asia, but also seeing it as a way of understanding race in the United States. Isabel Wilkerson contributed mightily to that understanding with her book on caste, which some of you may have seen or read. Almost any story that we work on, and almost anything that I've tackled in terms of exhausted, in terms of series, including another one called Underground Trade, where we looked at the exploitation of women, mainly, and a route between South Asia, between East Asia and the United States, Flushing, New York, and a corridor of human trafficking, bringing us up to New England. That story was only possible by talking with and getting to know members of Asian communities. Some of that happened by working with what used to be called the Asian Women's Center in New York, who were very concerned about human trafficking and this route of human trafficking between Thailand, southern China, Vietnam, and the United States, principally Flushing, New York. That became possible because, again, of getting to know and sitting down with people over a period of time. That is the key, again, to reporting in a polarized society. Getting to know the people who you might not think you have anything in common with, but the factor of empathy becomes a reason for people to open up, because you're listening. You're actually listening to what they have to say, and you're actually you're checking the information as you go, obviously, but you're listening. And by listening, and they're convinced that people are convinced that you're listening and actually paying attention, it helps you basically navigate. And it helped me navigate this series and allowed me to report on a topic that was essentially taboo, and that a lot of people were afraid to talk about. Again, this was the underground trade, which you can find on GBH's website and on PRX's website. I'm going to wrap this up by, again, going back to my background in Detroit. And I find it interesting that I'm now reporting on extremism. When I was a kid, I'll never forget, about 8 or 9 years old, my mom brought us down to a park in downtown Detroit called Kennedy Park. And there were a group of men demonstrating at that park in uniforms with swastikas on. These were members of the American Nazi Party. I was blown away by this at the time, even as an 8 or 9-year-old, and came to realize that you had folks so extreme in this country. We saw what was happening, of course, part of that extremity you could see in the context of Klan activity in the South. I later covered some of that. You could see that in terms of what was happening with folks who were attempting to integrate schools in Boston. You could see that. And as what I've come to learn, of course, is that history, of course, is ongoing. It's constantly being made. And that there's a series, as we all know, of things that occur in our society, the notion of forward movement and backward movement. And part of our coverage of a polarized society is to understand that there are always attempts by the most extreme to bring the country back to a time that really was not favorable to most of us, but basically codified this notion of white supremacy. Yes, that's a real term. It may be overused at times, but it also has historic and realistic gravitas, if you will, or gravity. That's what I meant to say. And so I think that when I'm covering extremism today, I'm always reminded of that time when folks were marching in Kennedy Square and wearing Nazi uniforms, and they're doing it today as well. I covered over last year groups that were protesting outside of Brigham Women's Hospital, groups that were protesting LGBTQ rights at a reading in Jamaica Plain. Folks who sent threatening letters to a woman in New Hampshire, Franklin, New Hampshire, because she's Jewish and had protested their presence. And so what I'm trying to capture is certainly that extremity, but what's become more important for me over the last 6 months is reporting on people who push back, but also reporting on people who could, in fact, be susceptible to these ideas if we do not, or if they do not basically find an alternative, and trying to understand who they are. That is the thing that I'm doing at the moment, trying to understand who the people are who are pushing back against growing extremism in this country, and those people who could be susceptible to it. I'm reporting on that group, and you might call it the middle, but gradually and increasingly, I should say, that middle is being really pulled apart. And a lot of people, a lot more than we would like, are gravitating toward the most extreme. I will leave it at that. Thank you.
What a fantastic presentation, Phillip. We so appreciate sharing your knowledge and really sort of this ethos around leaning into empathy and your own personal experience to strengthen our reporting. And I think that is a fantastic approach when we think about all of our lived experiences and how important that is, that we bring our own lens and what we've experienced, throughout our lives as we approach people, community members, because we're part of the community as well. And we have our own experiences that, lend perspectives that allow us to connect deeper with folks. And I appreciate how you sort of explain that, Phillip. And yes, and we do have a question in the chat. I want to get to questions here. Corey Princell says in the chat that these stories are really powerful. And and you talked about some of the issues, say, around extremism that we're seeing more of in New England nowadays. And what are some of the specific issues you think our newsrooms should be focusing on more in New England with the polarization that we're seeing here?
I think perhaps the most important issue right now is immigration, is migration. We're watching as migrants are being bused into shelters, so on and so forth. But you also have an assumption from many people that this is a zero sum, that if migrants are being assisted and aided, then that is then that's going to cause extraordinary discomfort, and or worse, it's going to cost money for taxpayers, and it will. And it definitely will cost taxpayers money. And so I think perhaps the most important issue, Vanessa, right now is to look at is a closer look at migration. Migration is one that, for example, extremist groups understand they could use to fire up their base. A neo-Nazi group, NSC 131, has been picketing outside of migrant centers, but so too have some local people, and it's amazing to see that where local people and neo-Nazis, and a lot of these local people would condemn these neo-Nazis, but all of a sudden find themselves on the same side as these people. They don't want to be, but all of a sudden, many of them, we assume, don't want to be. I have not done this story yet, so I'm going to reserve some judgment. But we see, for example, in social media, some of these same people saying, "Well, I condemn these Nazis, but there are too many immigrants coming into our society." So it's not just New York where Mayor Adams is pushing back against migration, and it's not just Texas where Abbott or Florida DeSantis. It's Massachusetts, it's New Hampshire. We've seen what's been happening in Maine for years, with some trying to demonize Somali migrants in Lewiston. You're starting to find a lot of concern around this issue in Massachusetts, with folks targeting largely folks coming in from Venezuela, from still coming in from the Dominican Republic, but largely those who are crossing the southern border in Texas, who have been brought to this area by bus.
Thank you, Philip. And we have a question from Melanie. Go ahead, Melanie.
Hi.
Hi.
This was such a great presentation. I just
Thank
had a
you.
question for you. You were talking about, earlier on when you were talking about the folks who supported Trump, and you were talking specifically about the son of the gentleman you interviewed, who was talking about immigration and his views on immigration. My question is, when you're talking to that person and their views, they're expressing their views, but when you start asking those deeper questions to kind of get at the root of what is it that's making them have these views, when you're getting at the real heart of it, when you're actually going then to write the story, can you take us through, like, what is the news judgment there? How are you deciding how you're presenting that? Does that make any sense? Like how are you balancing out what of his views you want to include to share that with your listeners and readers, and then how much of the, like, what's this is why I couldn't write it in the chat. It's kind of a complicated question, but how do you balance that out, and how do you get at the real issue that the gentleman might feel and truly genuinely hold, versus sort of maybe rhetoric or the thing he's attaching or blaming for that feeling or issue?
It's actually a really good question, Melanie. This is how I do it and did it. Unfortunately, that's part of the story. My editor, it didn't survive the edit, because these are short pieces. But what happened here was he interrupted his father during the conversation to talk about, to basically rage against immigrants. And I thought it was relevant to what he was feeling, and this issue of scapegoating, because this is what it was. When he was talking about his own economic anxieties, he brought up the issue of immigrants. And at the time he was working on the Ohio Railroad, the son, he's an older kid. He was about 19 years old at the time I interviewed the family. And I did write in that he wrote his comments down, included that in the piece. And this, by the way, was not for GBH. This was for a Canadian documentary on looking at Trump and Trumpism. And what I also did was I checked with the Ohio Railroad in the specific area where he was working, and found that there were no immigrants, if you will, working with him. There was no competition for his job in this particular area, and so on and so forth. And I included that in the piece. So while at the same time quoting the Sun, I also pointed out I used that great word "but" to say, but we checked with the railroad, and there were no immigrants, recent immigrants, rather. Everyone considers themselves an immigrant, don't they? But there were no recent, except Native Americans. There were no and Black folk. There were no recent immigrants. In other words, I basically pointed out, Melanie, that he had made this assertion that had no basis in fact. It was important for me not to let his comments stand. I wanted to include his comments because his anxiety and his anger were extraordinary. When he interrupted his father to talk about those, he used a specific word that I won't repeat here, to talk about those immigrants. And it was important at that point to juxtapose what he was saying with facts. And the fact is that he was not, in fact, being discomforted, being disadvantaged by immigration in any specific way. He decided to put it out there as a point, but it wasn't true. And we're dealing with that a lot right now, where people assert things that are just patently false, easily disprovable, and because it's disprovable, I think it's always important for us to put that out there, that this did not happen. I find it interesting if you remember Kellyanne Conway, who was an advisor to Trump, when she used the term alternative facts. Do you remember that? She used the term alternative facts at one point. Well, alternative facts have become real huge in our world today, where a lot of people believe you can say just about anything, including that the 2020 election was stolen, and large numbers of people believe it. It would be one thing, in reporting in this polarized society, we always have to insert what is, and a lot of reporters do this, and it's good to see. They didn't always fact check as they went. 2016 was a disaster for a lot of for journalism in many ways, because one network, and I will pick on that network, CNN, for example, covered Donald Trump, and almost anything he said just went out there in the atmosphere without any type of check, without any type of data analysis, without any type of pushback with truth. Almost anything he said was just put out there and it was promulgated as truth, and a lot of people believed it. A lot of people who I spoke with in Ohio believe, for example, that Donald Trump was a successful businessman. What does that mean? How do you measure success? There are Harvard Business School studies that say success is this. There might be other studies that say success is this, but success certainly cannot be bankruptcy after bankruptcy and refusing to pay construction workers, painters, house cleaners, and others. So what does that mean? You can have an interpretation of reality, but then there's also reality. I think the interpretation of reality is something that's called verisimilitude. But but then there is reality. And getting back to Bill Amashi's son, he can state one thing the same way that Donald Trump can state one thing, but it's important for us to counter that with facts, figures, data, other interviews, things that basically allow us to get to the truth in an age of disinformation and misinformation.
Yeah, Philip, I mean, important points, and we are coming up for the end of the hour, but I was wondering if you could sort of help us wrap things up and we think about, local newsrooms. We have smaller newsrooms, in our region, mid-sized, bigger newsrooms, and these are so much complication here, very complex issues, what you've described. You're a senior investigative reporter. You've had time to, delve into some of these issues, build relationships, go to the island, talk with many people about what they're experiencing. And I wonder if you have any advice for newsrooms that want to play a role in reporting on polarization and marginalization in our communities, but they don't know sort of how to start, and they feel like, oh, this is really complicated. Like, how do I even get into this? And one of the questions in the chat was from Bijan, and he's pointing out that there's a lot of mistrust from people who consider the media, sort of the enemy. And so, how any advice you might have for some of our local newsrooms here in New England that just needs some help or advice on just how to get started, because this is so complex and it is polarizing, like you've described this whole hour.
That's you summed it up. Bijan's question is absolutely important and relevant in that same context. What I would do, and though we're a larger newsroom, we have also limited resources. Let's think, for example, think together about a story that I haven't done yet, but I'm planning on doing, and you may be doing the same story. Let's think about the migration story, for example, the immigrant story. We know that it's important for us to speak with one of these migrants, and to go to one of these shelters where a lot of people think you're spending too much money on. And that and their taxpayers are being wasted. I mean, their tax money is being wasted. What I would do and planning on doing is I'm going to find someone from this community to find out their story, one of these migrants. And this is not unique, by the way. A lot of reporters are doing this, but I want to find out their story. I want to dig a little deeper. That may mean obviously, I don't speak Spanish, so I'm going to go with someone who speaks Spanish, not necessarily a translator, maybe a friend. I have lots of friends who speak Spanish. And I'm going to sit down with this person or persons, I'm thinking about one person, and try not to do it at the shelter, and that's, of course, for both audio reasons, but also to make that person feel more comfortable. I'm also going to, in that same story, I'm going to find someone who wants migrants out of my community, and so on and so forth. I want to find out who that person is. And I want to find out who they are beyond their shouting and screaming and frothing and writing on social media how they hate these people. Why? Who are you? And what is what is it in your background that makes where you see your background and your life and your very being antithetical to the people who are coming into this country, so on and so forth. And of course, you're going to talk to those who are trying to make policy. But the most important two people in this story is the person who wants to be here and the person who doesn't want them here. To understand that polarity, and to understand that polarity, I have to understand who these individuals are. The person who desperately wants to be here, and the person who desperately wants to kick them out of the country.
Well, Phillip, I mean, thank you so much again. I think you've helped so many people through your presentation today. Again, Phillip Martin, thank you, Senior Investigative Reporter at GBH News. So appreciate you sharing your expertise and stories with us. And thanks to everyone who joined us today for your questions. And as we continue to learn and grow and gain new knowledge so we can better serve our communities, I want to note that this webinar was hosted by the New England Equity Reporting Community of Practice, which is funded by the Endowment for Health based in New Hampshire. Thanks so much to the Endowment for Health for supporting strong community journalism. And with additional organizational support from Solutions Journalism Network, the New England News Collaborative, NEMPA, and the Granite State News Collaborative. Thanks again, Phillip.
I appreciate it.
Being with us.
Appreciate it, Vanessa.
Yes.
Just in closing, just a last point.
Absolutely.
I think, Angela and everyone, thank you. Bernice, Bijan, Tara, everyone. Linda, I'm looking here at the
A lot of thanks and
yeah, I really
shout-outs
appreciate
coming
that.
into the chat.
One thing I would just say to Bijan, I think really interesting point. They're taking our jobs isn't truly honest when most well, that's correct. I don't think we should settle for a response from someone who says they're taking our jobs. If in fact you can again juxtapose what they're saying with, we have to come to those interviews prepared. I'm not going to go into an interview without having looked at the migration impact on that particular town, on the amount of money being paid for that shelter, and what taxpayers, for example, are expected to pay. In other words, I would be prepared to counter a comment like they're taking our jobs, because it is essentially a dishonest job. I mean, a dishonest response when we know that statistically that's just not the case. Thank you again.
Yeah, I love that, Phillip. Okay, empathy, memory, history, and data, bringing that data. I love that you ended the webinar with that because it's so important.
That's right.
And really helpful for people listening and tuning in.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Phillip, and thanks for everyone for joining us. I hope you all have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.